Hello all, welcome back. And I have with me Fernando Raul from Puerto Rico, who is one of the most energetic astrologers and YouTubers that you can find. And he's also my very close friend and a colleague from the astrological community. So this is one of those so many things that we are doing together. And today we are going to talk about Vedic astrology and Vedic tradition in Latin America, with special reference to Vedic astrology. And thank you so much, Fernando. Welcome back.
Thank you, Aswin, for having me once again in your fabulous channel.
So this is one of the most untouched cultural and demographic areas concerning Vedic astrology, or in general astrology itself. So see, everyone has some kind of connection with from India. I mean, everyone from India has some kind of connection with Europe, USA, Australia, New Zealand, and other parts of the world. But Latin America seems to be a far-off destination for everyone in India. So there is a very less amount of population from India that are actually living in Latin America. So and how do Latin Americans look at Indians and Indian Vedic tradition in general?
Well, it's very interesting because unlike Anglo countries like the States or Great Britain, Latin Americans are very different. They're more Latin per se. They're more American. So we are not necessarily like the British or the Americans. We're something else, right? And Indians are seen as a very exotic people, as a very exotic culture. From the Latin American perspective. But without a doubt, in the last decades, with the development of the internet and the development of free flow information through the World Wide Web, more and more people from my generation are coming into contact with influences from other cultures. And although I'm familiar with Indian culture, Indian history, obviously Vedic thought, a lot of people more and more are knowing India, but they know India through the basic things, yoga, the food, the idea of the culture. But they the majority of the people have no idea of the intricacies of the Indian culture, of the idea of as India as a huge conglomerate of different types of culture coming together under one country, and also the other socio-political aspects of India, in relation to the other countries that surround them. But in a sense, India is seen as a very exotic culture. Obviously, the polytheistic aspect of India, of the religion, is very present in the Latin American zeitgeist. Obviously, from a very simple point of view, and also, as we're going to see, the development of Vedic thought and in relation to Jyotisha in Latin America is exponentially growing year by year. So in a way, as globalization is taking hold of our world, the world is becoming even smaller. And, it's a matter of time until, people from India and Latin America, begin to understand each other much better. And by the way, we have a lot in common with India in terms of our development as countries. Our climate is sometimes very similar, and even the culture. We're more of a we're more Mediterranean. We're more accustomed to the heat. We're more accustomed to being more open than maybe British or Americans are.
Okay, so see, the way this is the general thought about Vedic tradition, and it is quite complementary and similar to what Indians think about Latin Americans and what Latin Americans think about Indians. So even from here, it is quite like people have a perception that Latin Americans, it is viewed as an exotic culture and tradition, but still people love Latin America. And I personally have seen, I follow some of the most important wildlife documentaries and other cultural aspects in relation to Latin America on Discovery and National Geographic and History Channel. So I have a little bit of hang of what Latin America as a culture offers. It is one of the most energetic cultures that we can find in current scenario. or the current era. And it is, as it is on the flip side of the coin, it is very interesting to note that Latin Americans have developed love for Vedic astrology. So, and
And it's growing. Yeah.
yeah, it's, as you said, the as it is, the entire Vedic thought and love for the Vedic thought is actually growing exponentially over the years, and due to the advent of social media, which we have already spoken about in length, things have already been set into motion. So in Latin America, concerning Vedic astrology. So when did Vedic astrology enter Latin America? Roughly, we cannot zero in on a specific date with anything, but still, roughly, is there a particular period or a decade when Vedic astrology was initially started or found in Latin America? Was it actually found by an Indian who was traveling to Latin America, or was it actually transmitted in the other way, like some Latin American coming to India for research and trying to split it? It is like a, is it a one man thing, or it is a community thing which happened in a collective manner?
Actually, it's a little bit of all of them. You know, I just, before we start, I just want to say that I like history, but I'm not a historian. And I made this research on the past week, and I tried to, you know, I talked with people who were older than me. I looked up information in the internet, and, you know, I made my research. And this is just an initial research, and I don't think anybody has really talked about this in the internet or on YouTube for that matter. But, you know, if we want to pinpoint a date of when astrology, Vedic astrology, Jyotisha, began in Latin America, we have to look at, you know, the 60s and the 70s, right? And during the 80s and the 90s, it was like, you know, it started sporadically, very slowly during the 60s and 70s, 80s and 90s, it started growing. But it is not until the early 2000s, late 90s, that we see, you know, a major Jyotish boom in Latin America. And we're going to talk about why this is. But before that, I want to make some important statements that, you know, people might say, wow, so late? Why is that? Well, you know, the idea is that Latin America, as some of your viewers might know, you know, Latin America is the West, right? We are Westerners. Of course, we are not Westerners in the traditional sense that maybe the Indians know Westerners as through, you know, the British, the Americans, or even Germans, or even Russians for that matter, although there's more Slavic than Westerners. But in a way, you know, Latin Americans are Westerners. But what is our main characteristics, right? You know, first of all, we speak Spanish, right? We don't speak English. So there you see like a clear difference between like what British or Americans in comparison to Latin America. The other main difference is that we're majority Catholic faith. We're more traditional Christians in terms of the old church, while the majority of Anglo countries are more Protestant, right? And, you know, another thing that explains why we didn't get that Indian connection for a while, besides these two issues that we speak Spanish, not English, we're Catholic, not Protestant, is that we really didn't have any connection to India. You know, Latin American countries have no connection to India at all. I mean, there are some countries who've had relationships with India for a while, from Latin America, especially Chile, especially, you know, the communist organizations probably had contact with India. But more, besides that, you know, there haven't been any real political connections between Latin America and India until, you know, very recently. So, you know, unlike other countries that have connections to India, especially Britain, for example, who colonized India for a while, we really don't have anything to do with India. It's like two different parts of the world who haven't been connected because we've never been related. We're in opposite sides of the world. And, you know, we are two very different cultures in principle, but, you know, in essence, you know, everybody's the same. And, you know, in a way, we are part of America, right? We're not part of Europe. You know, in theory, in Europe, you can take a car and ride from
Yeah,
you know, from Germany to India. It's possible. I mean, people have done that, but you can't do that here. I mean, you got to take a trip an airplane trip, and it's very expensive. So you see, there are two islands going on here, and it hasn't been until very recently that Vedic Jyotish has been present in Latin America. Although, let me pinpoint is that although Jyotisha didn't explode in Latin America until the early 2000s, the presence of yoga, the presence of meditation has always been part of America, per se, North and South America. So even though there was no presence of Vedic astrology, there was a presence of yoga, of Hatha yoga, meditation. All these gurus that came to the States also had Latin American students, but the development of astrology per se didn't come until the early 1990s, late 2000s. But as I said, it started more or less in the 60s and the 70s. Why? Because, one of the main organizations that brought Indian culture, Vedanta, to Latin America, without a doubt, was ISKCON, which is, the International Christian Cultural Society, founded by Prabhupada in the mid-60s. And that basically, they were the people who founded different temples all along Latin America, spreading the Vaishnavism, I think it's called in English, Vaishnava, the devotees of Krishna. And they built these temples, and they had their own Jyotishis. But these Jyotishis were in these temples. And people would come into contact with Vedic astrology through these Jyotishis. But as I said, it was sporadically. It was just part of these small spiritual groups, religious groups. And, it didn't captivate the zeitgeist of the people, because in Latin America, we've always had astrology, right? But it was Western astrology. It was modern astrology. Here in Latin America, topocentric astrology is very popular. Psychological astrology is very popular. New Age astrology is very popular. So we also have Mayan astrology, but that came afterwards. That's much newer. But the idea, in terms of the discovery of it, obviously it's very old. But the thing is that there were a lot of astrological schools going on in Latin America. So, Jyotish had a lot of competition to go along, right? Just the same as Jyotish has a lot of competition in Anglo-speaking countries. And, it started in the 60s and the 70s, but sporadically. It started with these Jyotishis in their temples and, talking about, the Gita, talking about the classics. But, bringing astrology as a side note to all this Vaishnavism faith in what ISKCON brought. And of course, then other groups came. But, meditation, yoga was present already in Latin America.
Okay. So as much as we've been agreeing to one fact that India and Latin America are two worlds apart, I cannot leave this stage without saying that my first astrology friend was from Latin America, and it was Fernando Raul. so there lies the very intimate connection between India and Latin America. And this video is going to be on YouTube, and it's going to be funny to so many people to hear that. I've been linked to my family, and I didn't have astrology friends until like 2017, early 2017. So I think that was when we had a chat, and
through Facebook.
Through Facebook, and again, at the advent of social media.
I don't even know how we ended up talking. Do you remember? I just remember you writing, or I was writing to you or something.
No, for some reason
we were in a group, right? Like a Facebook group of those sorts.
Yeah. We were in a group, and I think we started initiating conversation where we exchanged each other's charts. You were doing tropical astrology while I was doing sidereal astrology.
No, I was doing I was starting to do tropical, but I was in the transition phase.
You mentioned that you were in sidereal. You were doing the sidereal astrology, and you were making a transition into doing tropical Vedic astrology. So, and I still
that was
remember,
like 2 years ago. Yeah, almost 2 years ago. Yeah, wow.
almost 2 years ago. So it's very funny for it will be very funny for people to hear that my first astrology friend is from Latin America. So that's as I already said. Yeah, that's pretty much descriptive of the love that Indians and Latin Americans have for each other. As it is, Indians love the way the Latin Americans celebrate and. Especially, see, they are very light-minded and they celebrate even a little thing. And after all, we have one life, and there is no point in staying without enjoying. So that's something that Indians like about Latin America. At least I kind of envy or admire about the Latin American tradition. And it is good that see, I knew and I was kind of. Aware a little bit that yoga and other principles of Vedanta were actually present in most parts of the world, and it must have been present in Latin America. And you kind of attested to that fact that yoga, meditation, and other principles of Vedanta were pretty much present in Latin America. And the actual base or the initiation point of Vedic astrology was through ISKCON. So this is what I really wanted to know. Like the first burst of Vedic astrology was through ISKCON, and the religious or spiritual leaders or followers of the ISKCON tradition had actually been Jyotishis as well, and they kind of initiated or started teaching Vedic astrology, or maybe they might have started doing readings or something like that.
Yes, sporadically in their temples, because they would bring people. And ISKCON, let me tell you, we could talk a lot about ISKCON, but ISKCON is a big organization that spread Hindu culture all throughout the world. And Latin America was greatly enriched by this cultural exchange. You know, for example, I live in Puerto Rico, and although there are different Indian centers, there's a Yogananda center, but the main hub of Indian, you know, religious culture and all that is ISKCON here. And actually, the only celebrations of Indian festivals are held through the temple. So, you know, that's an example, right? But, you know, in other countries, there are other organizations. Also, there have been a lot of gurus that have traveled Latin America. So, you know, what we've seen through the 20th century is like this first cultural exchange of how Vedanta has come into the Latin American world. And, you know, it started in the 60s and the 70s, but then in the 80s and the 90s, it started growing little by little as we're going to go on.
Yeah, and as I see with the number of like astrologers doing doing Vedic astrology in Latin America, with the number of YouTube channels that are growing from Latin America, I think the future for Vedic astrology in Latin America is quite it is very bright. So
definitely.
the other thing that I wanted to bring in here is that as you already mentioned about the languages, English is not the primary languages, and the actual establishment of or the foundation of Vedic astrology lies in Sanskrit. So for some reason, Indians, even though not every Indian knows Sanskrit, very few Indians know Sanskrit, because Sanskrit is out of it is not being spoken currently.
It's like Latin in Europe. It's the old language.
Exactly. So no one speaks classical Latin. So no one speaks classical, or there is no modern Sanskrit. That is just ancient and ancient Sanskrit. So as it is very difficult for people to follow Sanskrit or Sanskrit terms from other parts of the world. Even I think not just Latin Americans, but from people or astrologers across the world, except India. So it is quite difficult to actually grasp the Sanskrit terms in the initial phase. So I'm not saying sorry.
That's why it started with the temples.
Yeah, exactly.
They were familiar with the Sanskrit terms. And another great obstacle that has impeded the growth of Jyotish in Latin America is that we speak Spanish. We don't speak English. So the Bibi Brahman books from the 80s and the 70s, we couldn't read them because they weren't in Spanish. And believe it or not, there hasn't been a good Jyotish book in Spanish. There are like 3 or 4, but they're not that good, or they've been translated from other languages. You know, I want to write a Jyotish book eventually. I'm in the process of, but you know, it's baby steps. but I want to do it correctly, you know, and it's probably going to take me several years or several volumes, but, you know, that's a dream of mine, to make a Spanish book, because the problem is that if you don't have a textbook, you can't teach. So,
Yeah.
you know, if you have obviously the Sanskrit, you can learn it, and you know Sanskrit. Obviously, if you have the ability to speak English, then you are able to learn. But you know, the Latin Americans didn't really speak English as a second language until very recently. You know, until late 90s, early 2000s. You know, people spoke English in Latin American, but they were like an elite group, a very small group, people who were educated in the States, people who were educated in Europe. But there are also other influences of French-speaking countries, Germany, without a doubt, you know, and you know there are a lot of influences in Latin America in that sense of higher education. But one of the main obstacles was that we don't know English, and there hasn't been any good Spanish Jyotish book. And well, I hope in the future to write one.
Yeah, and I think I'm pretty sure that you will end up finishing it. But that was my actual question. So, so the language and the barrier of English not being a primary language in Latin America has always proved to be a huge hurdle in terms of Vedic astrology's growth in Latin America. So now with the with the number of Vedic astrologers or the Jyotishis growing in Latin America. Is Spanish the only Latin American language, or I think Portuguese is also one of the most primary
Yes,
languages?
yes.
So
In Brazil, but I'm not. I really didn't. You know, we are. They're part of Latin America, but they're not. You know, it's not a Hispanic country. It's a Portuguese Hispanic. It's a Portuguese speaking country, and in Brazil, astrology is huge,
yeah,
huge. But you know, sometimes we include them in certain things, sometimes we don't include them in certain things. But you know, the development of Jyotish in Brazil is something that I really didn't look up, because they speak Portuguese and not Spanish. So what I'm talking about is the Spanish speaking
Spanish
country.
speaking. Okay, yeah,
Yes,
I
and
understand.
the majority of them speak Spanish. There's some countries who have secondary Indian languages. I mean, with Indians, I mean native Indian Americans, right? Like Quechua in South America, Guarani maybe. You know, there are a lot of small speak, but they're not really that prevalent. They're just minority, but the majority of people speak Spanish, and as a second language, they might speak English, French, or German. So, or even Portuguese for that matter. But you know, the inability of English, and also the competition from other astrologies, were basically the main hurdles or obstacles to the growth of Jyotish until now, which is growing. And we're gonna say why.
Okay, why?
Okay. So after
So
after perfect
no,
after this.
I just didn't want to interrupt you, because as it is, we are speaking about the language as a major barrier. So anyway, so let's get to this. How many YouTube channels are there in? Do you know of any other YouTube channel?
Yeah, several, but we haven't gotten there. Aswin, let
Okay,
me
yeah.
go thing by thing. You know, after the 60s and the 70s, which was, you know, a small spiritual thing. Then in the 80s and the 90s, you know, things started to get more secularized, right? You know, you were starting to see Yotish coming out of this, you know, religious context. And, you know, a very important man who started this in Latin America is a man called Jose Garcia. I
Okay.
have I have two interviews with him in my channel. Obviously, they're in Spanish. But, you know, if there is a father of Vedic astrology in Latin America, that would be him. And, you know, he's Puerto Rican. He studied astrology with a man who was a disciple of Alan Leo.
Oh,
So yeah, very, very interesting. And he was a psychologist, and he came into, you know, Vedanta. He came to study Sanskrit on the early 80s. And in the mid 80s, with a friend of mine, with a friend of his, I'm sorry, called Hector Totti, he brought people from India to Puerto Rico, which is the country I live in, to give conferences on Yotish and Ayurveda.
okay.
And, you know, there you started seeing the transition, because as he told me, he used to study astrology, Western astrology, and when he heard about Jyotish, he said, this is going to be easy. I'm going to buy all the classics and I'm going to read it with my friend and we're going to do Jyotish in a man. And he bought the books and he was like, what the heck is this? I can't do this. This is very different from what I've been taught. So what he did is that he went to an Indian who was teaching in Venezuela. His name was Dr. Kesh Babath. So Kesh Babath was from Bangalore, and he was the professor of botany in the University of Cumaná in Venezuela. And he basically, Kesh Babath, what he did was he adapted Ayurveda to the tropics. So he adapted the concepts of Ayurveda to the Latin America tropical diet. So, he went there because he heard of this man, and he started coming here talking about Ayurveda, talking about, English teachings. And Jose Garcia told him, look, I want to learn Jyotish. And he said, well, you should go to a friend of mine. I think they were family. Because he's a Jyotish guru, he has a lineage. He's from Kerala, and he started learning astrology with Dr. Krishna Bhatt, who at the time was more or less a contemporary of his, and he was a doctor in physics and astrophysics, in addition to being a Jyotishi.
Okay, that's a deadly combination.
Yeah, he's a professor in Mangalore University.
Okay,
right now.
Mangalore.
Mangalore with M.
Yeah, Mangalore.
Yeah, Mangalore. And he's part of the Department of Human Consciousness and Yogic Sciences. And Jose started learning with him, long distance. And he would come to Puerto Rico. And at the same time, Jose would spread Vedic astrology to Latin America, right? And, there were other initiatives. During the 80s and 90s, there was a time where a Colombian university, I didn't get the name, but there was a Colombian university who dedicated itself to translate the Ayurvedic classics into Spanish. Oh. So you see that during the 80s and the 90s, the concept of Jyotisha was slowly being secularized. But what happened? Jose told me that when he started doing astrology, people would laugh at him, because they would say, here's an astrologer that changes everybody's signs, right? Because it's sidereal astrology.
Yeah.
And you're accustomed to tropical astrology. So he faced a lot of obstacles in the beginning. But, he taught in Mexico, he taught in Venezuela, and he spread slowly the Jyotish teachings. At the same time, I'm pretty sure other people were doing the same thing in other Latin American countries, but in a smaller context. I'm sure that, the Bibi Raman books were read by people in Latin American countries who knew English. But, Jose started doing this little by little. And he's considered, without a doubt, the father of Vedic astrology in Latin America. As I said, I have a couple of interviews there. And he started learning Jyotish from this Dr. Krishna Bhatt from Kerala, who was, he had a Jyotish parampara. I mean, he had a lineage. And ever since then, he's been practicing Vedic astrology with the Surya Siddhanta method, which is very interesting, right? And you see that during the 80s and the 90s, things started, coming up. But Vedic astrology didn't explode until the early 2000s. Why? What happened in the late 90s? In the early 2000s, late 90s?
So, as it is, there were two people.
I asked you a question. What happened in the late 90s, early 2000s?
The advent of internet and
exactly. There you go. Exactly.
The advent of internet and social media had actually opened the floodgates for Vedic astrology to Latin America. So, getting back to what you said, there were two people who played a major role in spreading or initiating the establishment or foundation of Vedic astrology in Latin America. Could you please tell the names again, because it is very difficult for Indians to. And
he's in my channel. His name is Jose.
Can you just spell it?
Oh, sure. You can look it in my channel.
Okay.
You're going to find his channel. His name is Jose, Jose Garcia, Garcia. And
Okay.
there were also people in Latin American countries who delve into Indian philosophy without a doubt.
Yeah.
You have Miguel Serrano from Chile, but
Okay.
he wasn't really into Jyotisha. He was into other aspects of yoga and even Tantra. I guess Alejandro Horodowski also, but he was more of a, he's more of a interdisciplinary type man. And there was a lot of interest with India during the 20th century, but the aspect of Jyotisha, the aspect of Vedic astrology, it didn't came into be until the 80s and 90s, right? Because there weren't any books written in Spanish. There weren't any famous astrologers. Although the most famous astrologer in Latin America, called Walter Mercado, he's Puerto Rican also. It's very interesting that these people are Puerto Rican like myself. Walter Mercado did study with B.B. Raman in India, but
Okay.
he's very flamboyant. He's a very, he's very cliche, but he's a man who studied. I mean, he's a man who acts in front of the camera, but at the same time knows a lot. He's a very studied man, but he's also, he projects himself as this figure of astrology, but he knows a lot. And he supposedly studied with B.B. Raman. So you also have there a connection of somebody who's the most famous astrologer in Latin America and still is. He's like almost like he should be in his late 80s, and he supposedly did study with B.B. Raman. He also studied with Osho.
Oh, yeah.
So there's a lot of influence there, but the main astrological influences in Latin America had some Indian influences. But at the same time, during the 80s and 90s, Jose told me that there was, a lot of difficulty because there weren't any books written in Spanish. He never wrote a book, which is something I always told him he should have done, but he didn't. And there was a lot of competition. Topocentric astrology is huge in Latin America. New Age astrology is huge in Latin America. Even traditional astrology, Hermetic astrology is very, very big. The Rosicrucians are very big. Psychological astrology is also very big. So, it's not like in India where you have like Jyotish. Here you have a lot of things because we're not only getting the English influence. We're not only getting the Spanish influence of astrology.
Yeah.
People who learn astrology are people who are, very educated, who have the ability to travel and study. And since, different Latin American countries have a lot of influences in terms of higher education from different parts of the world, you're getting a lot of different astrological influences from different parts of Europe, from France, from England, from Germany, from Spain. And you have a lot of heterogeneous astrological practices, which is still a problem here. It's not a problem, but it's a reality that there are a lot of astrological practices and schools going on. But, Jyotish more or less started in the 80s and 90s, but with the advent of the internet, man, it just blew. Like, in the early 2000s, like, you have a boom of Jyotish in Latin America. Why? Because information is easily accessible. And at the same time, people are learning more English as we go by. People are hearing pop music, people are hearing rock, and even though, an important thing is that I'm from Puerto Rico, and, one might think, then why did this happen in Puerto Rico? Well, Puerto Rico is part of the United States. We're more like a colony, like maybe Hong Kong was part of Britain during 20 years ago. Well, we're part of the States, and English, we learn English since we're in kindergarten, all right? Not everybody speaks it here in the country, but more or less everybody understands it. So Jose had the ability of being bilingual, you see?
Okay. Yeah.
So he communicates with his guru, Dr. Krishna Bhatt, in English. But, he also told me that when he went there were people who didn't speak English, who only spoke Sanskrit and Karana, I think it's the language they speak there.
You spoke about the Mangalore University.
Mangalore, yes, he's a doctor there.
That is the language Kannada.
Karada, yeah, and he told me that when he goes there, he has to speak Sanskrit because they won't understand him. But and the thing is that, you know, we are bilingual, so we have that ability to, you know, travel to the States, study in the States, study English. So in a way, you know, we had the opportunity to use the language to come into contact with the Indian culture. There were also people in Latin America who knew English, but generally people who speak English in Latin America, you know, 30, 40 years ago were high class, were people who had, you know, the ability to travel, the resources to, you know, learn the language. It wasn't very widespread, but now it is very widespread thanks to the internet and all this. So now we can see that there's a third stage, right? It started in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. It's growing. And now from the 2000s until on, you see a great boom, especially through social media. And that's what Jose told me. He told me that after 2000s, he would travel and people would know, in theory, right, what Vedic astrology was, especially people who were into astrology. And with the advent of social media, I mean, we have gotten a lot of astrologers. I mean, one specific astrologer, which is very big in YouTube, is called Ramanuja Das. He has a Spanish-speaking YouTube, and he's probably one of the first people ever to upload Yotish videos to YouTube.
In Spanish?
No. In any language.
Okay, in any language, okay.
Yes, his videos are like 11, 12 years old, some of them.
Okay.
So he was uploading in 2006, 2007 already in Spanish.
Okay.
So it's very interesting. Before KRS, before even Samjepi, I mean, he was uploading material. He's a pioneer in many ways. You know, he's from Peru, and he has a good channel. He's still uploading videos. I believe he's living in Italy. I'm not sure. You know, I want to have him in my channel. I haven't contacted him, but I want to interview him. But the thing is that he's a pioneer in many ways. I believe he was an Vaishnava initiate. I'm not sure. I don't want to say that, but he was very knowledgeable about Sanskrit. And what he did is that he started a YouTube channel uploading Jyotish videos in Spanish. And not only that, he translated Santanam's Brihat Parashara Shastra edition from English to Spanish.
Spanish, okay. That's
so
great.
Finally, we have a Spanish Brihat Parashara Shastra. And I'm not sure if that's the first Spanish translation of Brihat Parashara Shastra, but I'm pretty sure it probably is the first or the second for that matter. But, you know, he started doing a lot of things. I mean, he started uploading videos a while ago, and he's still doing, and he teaches traditional Vedic astrology all around the world, and he's traveling constantly. And he is not only a pioneer in Latin America, but a pioneer in YouTube as per se, Jyotish videos. So, you know, and there are other Latin American Jyotishis who are popular. There's also an Uruguayan astrologer called Krishna Darshan, which is connected to Comila Sutton and their group, and they have a farm in the States, and he's also Latin American, and he's also a good Jyotishi, and he teaches classes. I want to have him in my channel to interview him. These are the two people I want to have that I haven't had. But as you can see, more people are learning Jyotish. More people are, not only that, more people are going into Vedanta as a whole. You know, people are initiating themselves. People are learning about yoga. I mean, yoga in Latin America is really big, as big as it is in the States and in Europe. I mean, people love yoga, and by yoga I mean hatha yoga. You know, people love yoga here, and people love meditation. I mean, there's a lot of things going on. I mean, maybe 30 years ago it wasn't as popular as in the States, but now it's less or more. You know, it's very popular. So with the advent of the internet, you open the floodgates. People are know English more or less now. People are coming into contact with the information, and also people are traveling to India. I mean, people are traveling to India to do things, and they learn Jyotish in the process. There are a lot of people who have learned Jyotish by being, you know, initiated into these practices. I have another interview in my channel with a man, an astrologer, who's also an engineer, called Prabhupada Nugadas. He's an initiate, and he translated Ernst Wilhelm's books into Spanish.
Oh,
So, you see how he became an initiate, and then he started learning Jyotish, and he went to India. And, he's the first guy who told me that there are a lot of things in India that haven't been translated. And,
yes.
that opened my mind to a lot of possibilities. But, you see here how that connection with India to the English language, it's slowly, changing the way, Latin America sees Vedic astrology, because even though it's growing, people still don't know what it is in many ways. Jose Garcia told me that many people, when he said he was a Vedic astrologer, which in Spanish is that you do astrología védica. Astrología is astrology, védica is Vedic. Well, people would confuse him, would confuse the word with médica, which would be like medic astrology, like a medic. And he would say, no, I'm not a doctor, I'm an astrologer. So, there's a lot of, there's still a lot of people don't know what Vedic astrology is. But, slowly, you see people coming up, and, you get people my age now, like a fourth generation that's doing this. And there are a lot of people like myself. There are a lot of Jyotish YouTube channels in Spanish. There are people who also mix it with other types of astrology, but there are a couple of people my age who are doing astrology. And at the same time, last year, an Argentinian astrologer published for the first time a Spanish-speaking panchanga in Argentina.
Okay.
His name is Deepak Ananda. You see all these names, they're initiates. Prabhupada Nugadas, Ramanujadas, Krishna Darshan, Deepak Ananda, they're all initiates, right? So you see how that influence from the religious perspective is coming into being here. He actually studied in India in a yoga university, and he came to Argentina, and he published the first Panchanga book, like an almanac for astrology and the lunar months. And actually, he just published the second edition, his 2018 book. And I also have an interview with him. So you see that, people are, more aware of Vedic astrology. We still have a long way to go. I'm not going to lie to you. Basically because of the English language barrier, which, slowly is disappearing every day, because more and more people speak English, more and more people are more familiar with English concepts. And, also in Colombia, there's an institution that is associated with IFAS, which is the Association of IFAS, which is the Indian Association for Astrology. So you see that little by little, Latin America is more and more connecting to, the Vedic world of Vedic astrology.
Okay. So anyway, the development of Vedic astrology has, I think you gave a very chronological and a sequential explanation in terms of.
I did my homework. Yeah, and for
people
who are watching this video who have, more knowledge about the topic, just write it down.
Yeah, sure.
There are a lot of things that probably went on between the 60s and the 2000s that maybe I'm unaware of, especially in South American countries like Argentina, Chile, Peru. I mean, if there's more information about how Jyotish developed in Latin America, please write it down. I mean, the more the merrier, and the more information we have, the more possible it is to, build this history for future generations.
Yeah, sure. So as it is, we have the dot of Vedic astrology in almost all the South American countries like Peru, Argentina, Puerto Rico, Chile, and even Brazil is there. I think there was, I even found out something like a Vedic astrologer is also there in Uruguay. So I'm not sure how it is in Paraguay, but it's there in Uruguay. Even though Brazil is a Portuguese-speaking Latin American country, there are Vedic astrologers. And with the number of Vedic astrologers growing over the years, I think, as you said, people have started reading or knowing English in Latin America, and there is the so there is a two-way development. Like people are looking to speak and publish YouTube videos in Spanish in Vedic astrology, and people in Latin America are also ready to read English books in Vedic astrology. And there was a period when, as you said, people used to read the translated versions of Dr. B.V. Raman, but I'm sure now people will be actually reading Dr. B.V. Raman's book in English itself. And B.V. Raman is one of the most important ambassadors who's a towering figure in terms of
Without
taking,
a doubt.
yeah,
I have almost all his books, by the way.
yeah, yeah. See, B.V. Raman was probably the sole reason for Vedic astrology to reach outside India, and after that, there were so many people.
Actually, there's a book of his that's called Vedic Astrology in the West or something that recompiles his trips to Europe and the
Yeah,
United States, which is very good. I read it, and you see, he was an ambassador. You know,
yeah.
and that's the thing. These people are remembered because they took the knowledge and they spread it. You
And
know,
exactly the names that you mentioned, like 5 or 6 names you mentioned, who actually initiated Vedic astrology in Latin America, are also one of those. Uh, uh, they are also among the pioneers because they actually initiated and they grew Vedic astrology in Latin America. So, as it is, you also said that there are a number of YouTube channels that are growing, which are dedicated to Vedic astrology in Spanish language itself. So that is probably another major, like it is a catalyst for growth, for Vedic astrology in Latina. So other,
and especially my channel.
yeah, I was about to mention, like, Fernando Raul has made a lot of um like astrology related videos on his YouTube channel, which is called Fernando Raul Astrology, and it is basically a Spanish speaking Spanish YouTube channel that teaches and talks about astrological concepts from the Indian Vedic tradition. And he Fernando has also initiated the English videos, which has and I think it is good that he's up to some one or two small projects that he's doing with other astrologers as a series in his YouTube channel, which will probably be in English. And also, as he said, we hope that Fernando brings those two astrologers he wanted to bring on his YouTube channel. And as I think your channel is one of the most established channels in Spanish, and it is also one of the platforms through which Vedic astrology can grow in Latin America, not just Puerto Rico, but in entire Latin America. So, is there a final thought that you wanted to say regarding, so, because it is almost there in every Latin American country. So by another 10 or 15 years, I think Vedic astrology will grow much more bigger than we can ever imagine. And as you already said, it is important for people to actually those who know some of the history of Vedic astrology in Latin America, even before 60s, or something that Fernando did not get in his research material that he has done for this video, which is a very commendable job. So please go ahead and comment on it. It will be a very useful information in terms of recording the history of growth of Vedic astrology in Latin America. So, is there a final thought that you wanted to add, Fernando?
Oh yes, the thing is that I have some of these guys in my channel, in my interviews with them, but they're in Spanish. And I just hope that, and I'm pretty sure in a couple of years, YouTube is going to have an algorithm to translate the subtitles into English. So, because especially from the Western perspective, a lot of people who are from the US or Britain learn Jyotish or have contacts with India more or less through the same people. And people who learn Jyotish from Latin America have contacts with other people from India. So from a Western point of view, you have another perspective that you Indians know very, because it's not the same to study astrology in the South if you study in the North. It's not the same if you study with someone and you study with, and there's a lot of things that we can learn about these different experiences in learning and growing. And it is a goal of mine to unite the majority of Spanish speaking astrologers who do Vedic astrology to have a more solid community, a solid exchange. because I've seen the problem is that there hasn't been, for example, there has never been a Vedic astrology conference in Latin America.
Okay.
There's never been any type of conference per se of Vedic Jyotishis. There have been astrological conferences without a doubt, but also a lot of Spanish speaking astrologers are unaware of the depth and the richness of Vedic astrology that can help the other astrological schools in the West to develop, especially now with all the recent discoveries of Hellenistic astrology. And it's a matter of time before we come together as one global astrology, because in the end it's the same Indo-European tradition in many ways, and the difference is that you still have your temples, and we destroyed our temples 2,000 years ago. So yeah, that's more or less the biggest difference, right? But it's starting. That's what I'm trying to say. It's slowly starting, and we are part of something bigger. And I hope that people learn from this little video, and to continue fortifying, strengthening our bonds as international Vedic astrologer practitioners, and to learn from each other, and to grow and to build something better for future generations for astrological practices.
Great. So there is one more important thing that I wanted to mention. The funny connection
Sure.
that I had with Latin American is when I was publishing the first inaugural issue of the magazine. The first copy was actually received by a Peruvian astrologer called Ana Andrade. She's not a Vedic astrologer. She's not a Vedic astrologer, but she's predominantly a Western astrologer who also uses asteroids in her astrological practice. But still, that is one of those serendipity form of connections that I had with another Latin American. So
my dad is from Peru.
Okay, that's great.
Yeah, my dad is Peruvian. My mom is Puerto Rican, but I was raised here, and my dad lives here since he was 15 years old. So okay. I have a Peruvian connection also.
Okay, so that's what there is some kind of unknown or not a very describable relationship between India and Latin America, which still feels very good.
I feel we have a lot in common.
Yeah,
I feel like Latin American and Indians, because when I studied in Europe, I made friends with people from India, I also made friends with people from Iran, but I had friends from India, from Iran, I connected with them because, our cultures, although they're different, we have a lot of similarities,
Yes.
Family is very big here, family is very important.
Yeah.
In Latin America, and the home, it's very important, and religious life is also very important. So, and we're also very open, and we're very, as you said, I'm from Puerto Rico, and I know what party and celebrations are. So, because Puerto Rico is the celebration capital of Latin America in many ways, but, we have a lot in common. And it's a matter of time before we discover that little by little.
Yeah. So I think this is one of those very important videos that we have done now. It's not just I'm not just saying that because we have done this, but I think this is one of those openings for people to know how Vedic astrology has been established and the foundations has been formed in Latin America. So, okay, I think this brings us to the end of this session, and thank you so much, Fernando, for your amazing research work.
Thank you.
I think I know you have put a lot of research work, and you have had a number of calls with. I think you spoke for an hour with to do and get materials for this video. So it is very kind of you, and I'm sure so many Indians are going to love this video.
Oh, definitely, and I think nobody has ever done this before. So I just hope that for people who are from Spanish-speaking countries, Latin American countries, Spain, just write down in the comments whatever in Spanish, in English, in whatever language and just write down so we can know more about this very interesting history.
Yeah, probably we can even publish a paper or something related to history of Vedic astrology in Latin America. I think that gives a very solid foundation and idea of how things have been going on in Latin America. So this, I think it was it was wonderful to wonderful talking to you on this, and I'm sure you were probably the best person who I can talk to at this point of time. So thank you so much, Fernando, for coming over, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.